My name is Curtis Baxter. I'm the moderator of this full scientific session, Indigenous Knowledge, Science and Ethical Frameworks. Thank you all for joining us. This presentation is one of 3 pre-recorded videos focusing on a speaker's material before all the panelists come together in February for the live discussion. In this video, Dr. Nanibaa Garrison will be discussing an ethical framework and Indigenous research policies. Midway through this video, Dr. Lee Bitsoy will be joining Nanibaa to further delve into the materials.
Hello and Yate. My name is Nanibaa Garrison, and today I'll talk about a framework for equitable inclusion of Indigenous peoples in genomics research. I am an associate professor at UCLA, which is located on the homelands of the Tongva people as a traditional land caretakers of the Tovangar. I am also Navajo from Navajo Nation, and a lot of my research and perspective is based on some of my personal experiences and also some of the academic research that I've conducted in the context of Indigenous peoples. I'll start by introducing myself in Navajo. She'e Nanibaa Garrison Yunishya, Ashi Hinishla, Do Bilagana Bashishchin, Todachini Dashache, Bilagana Dashanella, Do Todanesha, Tetnasha. I basically just described who I am, where I'm from, and how I fit into this world. So I'll start by talking about representation of Indigenous peoples in genetic research studies. In an analysis of genome-wide association studies that was conducted in 2016 and 2009, we see that Indigenous peoples are actually very underrepresented in genetic research studies. In these 2 studies, in 2009, it was found that of all of the genome-wide association studies, 96% of the people were from European ancestral backgrounds. And although we've seen a number of people participating in genome-wide association studies that has changed the demographics of what we see in these studies, a lot of that growth was actually done in Asian countries. In the 2 bar charts on the right-hand side, the number of, or the percentages of Indigenous peoples actually decreased from 0.06%, which is represented in dark green at the very bottom, to 0.5% in 2016. So one question I have is, why is this? When we think about lack of representation in research, we think about many different potential reasons that might contribute to that lack of representation. Some of these reasons might include historical distrust of communities in research studies, perceived lack of benefits. Perhaps a community might feel like participating in research might not lend any benefit to them or to their community. Sometimes research challenges a person's cultural norms or the way that they think about themselves or who they are and where they are from. Oftentimes, communities have different health priorities that might not necessarily align with research or with genetic research specifically. Also, there's a growing lack of control or growing lack of concern about control over secondary uses of data. And finally, there are some concerns about outsiders conducting research. For example, people who are not from a community coming into a community conducting research, and they might be asking questions that are not necessarily pertinent to the community or might lend to some biases or different ways of interpreting data that are not necessarily aligned with community priorities. So in the rest of this talk, I'll describe a framework that myself and colleagues have developed to promote ethical research in genetic research studies, and then also some efforts that I've been engaged in to develop Indigenous genetic research policies for different tribes. So first, I am a member of the Summer Internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics Consortium. We are a group of Indigenous scholars and geneticists who are very interested in engaging scholarship in genetics or in very much aligned fields in genetics such as bioethics, law, social sciences, and anthropology. One question we had was, how should researchers foster stronger collaborations with communities? And to think about this, many of us are all very interested in promoting the inclusion of all populations, as this has the potential to expand our understanding of genetic influences on health. So the SING Consortium members and I developed a framework where we summarize a framework in this figure, which is thinking about multiple different elements of community-based participatory research, as well as bioethics concepts, and also thinking about what tribal communities are concerned with. In this figure, we have core elements that are the foundation of ethical research, starting with the core, which is sovereignty and research regulation, which is understanding how research is conducted and is governed in different community settings as well as community engagement. And then we have bioethics concepts that are integrated throughout in the spokes around the circle. And the cyclical representation shows relatedness. I'll dig into this a little bit deeper in the next slide. So to start, we think about understanding tribal sovereignty and research regulation. For example, different groups might have their own research review boards or different ways of reviewing how research is conducted within their communities. The second step is really to think about how to engage and collaborate with a community in a way that is meaningful and that is beneficial to the group. And engagement really means bidirectional communication and developing relationships with the community. We also think about building cultural competency. So researchers who are engaged in research really need to think about the culture in which they are working in and the culture of the people that they are working with. And next, we also want to think about transparency of research practices. To do so, we need to improve communication. We need to think about how to be open and honest with each other about how research is being conducted and what research questions are being asked, and so that research questions that are not of benefit to the community are not pursued. We also think about building tribal research capacity, and by doing so, we are thinking about training the next generation of Indigenous scientists. We are thinking about training community members to be engaged in helping to do data collection or data analysis for the research. And also we think about disseminating findings in ways that are accessible to the community, in ways that the community can understand and can implement in ways that will be of benefit to them. The summer internship for Indigenous peoples in genomics has been very engaged in training the next generation of scientists. And so we've been around for over 10 years and have trained over 100 different Indigenous peoples who are interested in pursuing academic work in genetics, or sometimes they are working in their community settings, thinking about genetics and policies and other scientific questions that their community faces. I've also been engaged in other work to develop Indigenous genetic research policies. And the reason for this is there are some tribes that are very interested in pursuing genetic research questions. They are interested in engaging in genetics research, but may lack policies, they may lack guidance, they may lack some principles for researchers to follow. So to start with this, I was very interested in understanding what existing Indigenous genetic research policies are available and how do different countries address Indigenous concerns. There are multiple different countries around the world that have Indigenous peoples. And so can we learn from these other countries? And how can tribes develop their own policies? So here I basically want to share that in one group that I've been involved in, we were looking at multiple different policies from different community settings from Canada, New Zealand, Australia, United States, and then also comparing that to the Indigenous Research Protection Act, which was written by the Indigenous Peoples Council on Biocolonialism, that basically put forward a proposed way of thinking about these policies. And comparing these policies across the board, looking at community engagement, rights and interests, institutional responsibilities, and ethical and regulatory oversight, we actually see that the United States is lagging far behind these other countries. So in the gray boxes are places where we are seeing gaps in policies, where these policies in these different countries remain silent on these different issues. And while I don't need to go through the whole chart, we see that the United States is lagging behind these other countries. So we have a lot of work to do. In thinking about these policies, we were able to identify gaps that the United States has, and we are also taking that information and trying to adapt policies for tribes, we being different groups that I'm working with. We are soliciting input from stakeholders and community members to understand concerns and hear recommendations. One way that I've been engaged in doing this is by conducting research on perspectives around genetics using surveys and interviews. And we can then place an Indigenous lens on Western policies. So I'm collaborating with another tribe that is really interested in developing a genetic research policy. And this is in order to be able to lift a moratorium on genetic research. As I mentioned very briefly previously, we are also conducting a research study to assess perspectives on genetics through the use of surveys and interviews of community members, and then also engaging the public in public outreach, community forums, workshops, and different forms of engagement has been really very important for soliciting input and thinking about things that are very important to the community, different priorities that the community has. So to conclude, we have stakeholders from many different tribes who are very interested in participating in genetic research. Many different tribes are interested, but sometimes we just need to think about how to do this in a way that is relevant and beneficial to tribal communities. Research studies can inform community needs to develop data-driven policies. This includes the surveys and interviews, for example. And then collaboration with stakeholders and community members are not only rewarding, but I think they can produce products that are beneficial to a wide range of people. So doing research that is very collaborative, very engaging with community members can really help to benefit both researchers and the community. So I just want to end by acknowledging the wide range of people who have helped in thinking through these questions and issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Nanibaa. Now, Dr. Lee Bitsoy will be joining the conversation. Welcome, Lee.
Yat e Nanibaa, yat e, how are you? It's nice to see you. How are things going with you?
Oh, yat e, things are going really well. Thank you.
So your presentation was really thought-provoking for me, and it really does focus on your role as an Indigenous geneticist, but also as an advocate. So I see you play a role, multiple roles in this capacity, but it takes a lot of advocacy work and then also a lot of education. And so what inspired you, or who inspired you to pursue this line of study and the field itself?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that I had a whole host of mentors starting as an undergraduate student, people who were very interested in helping me navigate academia, navigate working in research labs. And in that whole process, I began to realize that Indigenous peoples were being left out of science. They were being left out of genetics. I had an interest in genetics pretty early on because I did an internship at the Department of Energy when the first draft of the human genome was being published. And so that really got me interested in thinking about addressing the gap and thinking about addressing health disparities from a genetics and genomics perspective. But as I started to work in different labs, I realized that a lot of people had a lot of questions about genetics. A lot of Indigenous peoples that I talked to had concerns. Some people were fearful, some people were hesitant, but people were curious. And I also even had some pushback, people trying to urge me to pursue a different path instead of a PhD in genetics. And so I think I just began to realize that there was a lot of misunderstanding and miseducation about genetics, but also an underappreciation for what it could do. So although I did my PhD in genetics, I realized early on and during my PhD work that I was much more interested in bioethics, policy, and working with community members. So I think my advocacy kind of came through in that way, where I began to find ways to bring presentations to different community settings that were more at the community level and trying to describe things from a community context using examples that community members were familiar with. And then that also prompted me to become involved in the summer internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics, or the SING program. And there we trained over 100 Indigenous people throughout the years. And I think one of the things that I've really been proud of lately is one of the communities that we are working with is interested in genetics. They're curious about genetics. And we have been working closely enough with some community members to help them understand some basic concepts about genetics. And they were able to go on to a local radio station and speak in their own native language about what genetics is. And that was really cool for me to see that they were able to integrate those concepts in a way that was meaningful to them and then convey it back out to community members in the native language. And so that was very rewarding for me to see that they were pulling all of those concepts together.
That's awesome. So sometimes, as an Indigenous scholar myself, sometimes a lot of the pushback that I get is, why are Indigenous people anti-science? And we just talked about how we're trying to have more of a pro-Indigenous approach, so that there's cultural integration and there's a solid understanding. And as Native people, as Indigenous people, we've always known science, and this, we just don't call it, but it is part of our culture. So thank you for doing that work as an advocate and is a leading scholar in genetics for Indigenous people. So the next question I have for you is really about, again, focusing on who you are and how does your indigeneity influence your scholarship and your work?
I think my indigeneity stems from the fact that I grew up on the reservation. I grew up in a household where culture was a big piece of our identity, and I grew up with some of the ceremonial practices and some of the um, cultural norms and thinking about certain taboos and behaviors that we are meant to observe. And that really helped me gain a deep respect for nature and all things being connected. And so that I think those concepts are very important to me. I have to think about balance. And in the Navajo culture, we think about balance. Hojon, Hojon is also like a concept that helps you think about how all things are related and how they are related to each other. So I think I bring that into my work, and I think about a lot of things as a cyclical process where there's a lot of reciprocity. There's a lot of things that are influencing each other. When you think about your actions in the laboratory, that has, even though you think you might be isolated in a lab and people whose samples were who contributed their samples to you in the laboratory may never see you again, there is still going to be an impact of your research on someone somewhere at some point in time, whether it's that community or a different community. So I think just being cognizant and recognizing that a lot of things are interconnected has been very important for me to understand why people have different concerns, how those concerns are related to each other, and it just helps me have a better holistic view on science and bioethics.
Jonia, as they say in Navajo, as we say. So that's really great. And I really do appreciate your work. And I know that a lot of Indigenous communities around the country and globally are looking at the work that you're doing, especially the SING program as well. I know it's had an impact on students, and I admire your ability to influence others. And as a role model, we appreciate the work that you do. So thank you so much.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much, too, Lee. It's been really awesome and such a pleasure to have gotten to know you over these years and see all of your advocacy work as well.
Thank you. Well, onward and upward, as they say. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you, Nanibaa, for your remarks, and Lee for joining the discussion about the material. Just a reminder, this is but one of 3 spotlight videos focusing on individual work of speakers before all the panelists come together in February for the live panel, Indigenous Knowledge, Science and Ethical Frameworks. Please check the AAAS Annual Meeting website for the panel's date and time. Again, thank you, Nanibaa and Lee, and you, the audience. And we look forward to seeing you at the live session in February. Goodbye.